50 years later, I look back on us being fired and I'm still pissed off. Sit down.
It was the scene no one saw, because CBS made sure of it. One taped performance, never broadcast, triggered a chain reaction that yanked one of television's most daring shows off the air without warning, apology, or explanation. In an era when Sunday nights were reserved for safe smiles and sing-alongs, the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour dared to slip in something else. Something sharper, riskier, and far too honest for its time. What was so provocative that it sent network executives scrambling and erased a hit show at its peak? The answer lies in a single, tightly scripted moment that never reached American living rooms, but still changed everything. You've heard of shows getting canceled for ratings. This one got canceled for saying too much. Let's rewind to the moment when silence became safer than satire. The forbidden segment. The forbidden segment that ultimately led to the cancellation of the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour centered on a 5-minute sermonette delivered by comedian David Steinberg. Styled as a satirical sermon, the monologue blurred the line between scripture and socio-political commentary. Steinberg, dressed as a rabbi, stepped into a mock pulpit and opened with biblical references only to pivot sharply into critiques of the contemporary political climate, specifically the Vietnam War and President Nixon's administration. The structure was deliberate. Begin with the sacred, subvert expectations with humor, then land with a potent critique. This rhetorical progression gave the segment both its comedic rhythm and its disruptive power. Visually, the segment's power was amplified by a stark, minimalist set. The stage was stripped down to a single pulpit, under a lone spotlight, resembling a spiritual space stripped of all grandeur, symbolizing perhaps the erosion of institutional sanctity. This design forced the audience to focus entirely on Steinberg's words and expressions, eliminating distractions and underscoring the sermon's seriousness beneath the satire. The lighting created a dramatic silhouette, isolating Steinberg and visually evoking the image of a lone prophet challenging an empire, mirroring Moses confronting Pharaoh, a metaphor that would soon become literal in his speech. One of the sermoner's most popular lines was the incisive statement, "Moses stood directly in the face of Pharaoh, apologies, Mr. President, and said, 'Take your soldiers and leave. I will assist you no further.'" This line condensed the biblical story into an explicit rebuke of Nixon, reframing the president as a contemporary pharaoh and the anti-war youth as Israelites led by conscience. The line provoked laughter from the TV studio audience, but its message was grimly serious. In the political climate of 1969, such an explicit defiance of presidential power, broadcast over a prime-time variety show, transcended the limit CBS managers were no longer willing to accept. The service ended with a short musical number by a folk trio who performed a song called "No More Promised Lands." The song, whose lyrics spoke of shattered state promises and disillusioned youth, reinforced the sermoner's message. As the last chord faded away, Steinberg removed his rabbinical shawl and proclaimed, "Peace, not war. Preach it." It was a line that combined satire, theater, and protest into one last defiant act. The piece, as a whole, was not simply a work of comedy. It was a performance of resistance. CBS would censor it from broadcast, but its message would radiate through bootlegs and memory for decades to come. But as the segment echoed through underground circles, what unraveled behind closed doors at CBS was far more chaotic than the public ever knew. Network in turmoil. In the months leading up to the cancellation of the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, CBS found itself locked in an escalating internal struggle over content control. What had started as minor script edits soon morphed into a network-wide campaign to monitor, revise, and suppress any material deemed politically sensitive. CBS instituted stricter censorship policies, requiring each episode to be submitted at least 10 days before airing for review by both in-house and external legal teams. These review windows were originally intended to maintain broadcast standards, but over time, they became tools for stalling and diluting controversial content. Tom Smothers, in turn, routinely pushed back, submitting scripts late or making last-minute edits that bypassed prior approvals, further heightening tensions. The pressure on CBS didn't come from inside the studio alone. Local affiliates, especially in conservative regions of the South, began to complain directly to the network about what they viewed as unpatriotic or irreverent content. Sponsors, too, grew uneasy. Companies wary of associating with anti-war sentiment or political mockery began threatening to pull their advertising dollars. These external forces played a significant role in narrowing the network's tolerance for risk. Behind the scenes, CBS executives faced a precarious balancing act, maintaining the show's high ratings among younger viewers while managing mounting backlash from stations, sponsors, and traditional audiences. Legal issues started eclipsing creative ones as internal CBS memos and boardroom conversation moved from ideas about programming innovation to concerns over liability. The network's lawyers became increasingly active in previewing episodes, providing cautionary advice regarding defamation, obscenity, and political bias. Sketched out lines on the program were reported to be cut not because they violated particular broadcast guidelines, but because they could arouse unwanted attention from the press or the government. And as the show's scripts became braver, CBS replied not with open-ended debate, but with bureaucratic obstacles, retarding approvals on episodes, requesting reshoots, or even withholding sections of episodes outright, without giving reasons. This climate of perpetual tension produced a visible erosion of trust between the network and the Smothers Brothers production staff. Tensions were no longer veiled or confined to memos. They spilled over into angry meetings, delayed deadlines, and stalled broadcast schedules. CBS increasingly viewed the show as less of an asset and more of a liability spinning out of their control. By early 1969, the battle lines were drawn. The growing efforts of the network to micromanage the show were reciprocated by equally resolute acts of defiance by Tom Smothers, foreshadowing the ultimate confrontation that would terminate the show permanently. A comic turned crusader, Tom Smothers began his television career as a clean-cut comedian, known more for his quirky charm and sibling banter with brother Dick than for any kind of political outspokenness. The duo's early appeal lay in their smart brother, dumb brother routine, which was light, family-friendly, and non-threatening. A perfect fit for the mainstream expectations of 1960s television. But as the social and political landscape of the United States grew more turbulent, Tom began to see comedy not just as entertainment, but as a vehicle for commentary. Gradually, he shifted from punchlines to provocations, moving beyond scripted gags to material that challenged viewers to think critically about war, inequality, and authority. As Tom's creative ambitions evolved, so too did the dynamic between the Smothers Brothers on screen. While Dick remained more traditional in his role, focused on timing, delivery, and maintaining the balance of the show, Tom became increasingly emboldened. He began writing or approving sketches that veered into overtly political territory, often without prior approval from CBS. Dick, ever the professional, didn't publicly resist Tom's growing defiance but was clearly the stabilizing force, frequently diffusing tension during heated tapings or smoothing over guest appearances that risked network ire. Their partnership, once rooted in comedic chemistry, began to reflect the broader national divide. One brother challenging the system, the other keeping the peace. Tom's genius was in his capacity to cover up serious criticism in the guise of comedy. Instead of presenting plain political invective, he inserted acid wit in the form of satirical sketches, folk songs, and parody editorials. This way, he was able to get away with raising the bar without necessarily alarming CBS's censors. Through the application of metaphor, double entendre, and irony, Tom wrote messages that struck a chord with younger viewers but glided under the radar of older executives, at least for the moment. The editorial features of the show, such as Pat Paulson's outlandish political campaigns, were an excellent example of this strategy, preposterous on the surface, but richly evocative of the anger of a generation disillusioned with war and bureaucracy. This innovative tactical maneuvering wasn't only smart, it was deliberate. Tom viewed his job not so much as that of a performer, but as that of an unofficial cultural provocateur working inside the constraints of network television. He was aware of the restrictions placed upon him by the medium and looked for methods to bypass them short of openly flouting the rules, short of realizing that even subversion would no longer be allowed. His evolution as a political presence on television represented an unusual instance of media history where a comedian happily jeopardized his career not for glory, but to be allowed to express something that counted. By doing this, Tom Smothers redefined the possibility of comedy as an instrument of dissidence. Protest in performance. The Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour quickly became more than a comedy show. It evolved into a cultural flashpoint, in part because of the bold, politically charged performances by its musical guests. Artists like Joan Baez, Jefferson Airplane, Harry Belafonte, and The Who brought with them not just popular appeal, but strong social and political messages. Joan Baez famously performed a song dedicated to her husband, David Harris, who was imprisoned for resisting the draft. Though the performance aired, CBS removed the spoken dedication, fearing it would provoke backlash. Meanwhile, The Who's explosive rendition of My Generation ended with the band destroying their instruments on stage, a chaotic symbol of generational anger that mirrored the unrest sweeping across America. These performances weren't just provocative because of the artists' reputations. They were staged in ways that visually and lyrically challenged the status quo. Musicians often used symbolic costuming, subtle gestures, or pointed set designs to convey messages that couldn't be said directly. Songs that referenced the Vietnam War, civil rights, or youth disillusionment were sometimes altered specifically for the show, either by the performers to enhance their message or by CBS to soften it. Jefferson Airplane, for instance, performed a song hinting at psychedelic consciousness and political awakening, coded language that resonated deeply with counterculture viewers, even if it slipped past some network censors. Behind the camera, CBS struggled to control these performances, sometimes editing them out altogether, or editing out lyrics considered too inflammatory. Performances were sometimes recorded, but never broadcast, excised during post-production with no warning. One of the most memorable was Harry Belafonte singing "Don't Stop the Carnival" over footage of the 1968 Democratic National Convention demonstrations. Although shot with complete creative approval from the producers of the show, CBS would not air it, claiming that it was too politically charged. These acts of censorship only added to the growing frustration among the artists and production crew who felt that the network was more concerned with image control than artistic freedom. Even with CBS's interventions, the musical moments were one of the strongest elements of the show's protest persona. They inserted activism into American living rooms not by direct confrontation, but by melody, metaphor, and deliberately constructed spectacle. The music said what too often could not be expressed in a spoken monologue. that a generation was no longer satisfied with entertainment that disavowed the world's unrest. For most viewers, particularly younger ones, the acts on the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour were their initial exposure to socially aware music on a mainstream stage. Thus, the show not only features artists, it amplified a movement. A nation divided. As the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour grew bolder in its political messaging, it quickly became a cultural battleground for American audiences. Younger viewers, especially those on college campuses, embraced the show as one of the few reflections of their frustration with the Vietnam War, civil rights struggles, and the perceived hypocrisy of traditional institutions. For many students, the show's satire, subversive music, and willingness to challenge authority made it must-watch television. They quoted lines from editorial segments, passed around tapes of unaired episodes, and even referenced skits in student newspaper editorials. To them, the Smothers Brothers were not just entertainers, they were allies in a broader generational fight for change. In stark contrast, many older and more conservative viewers saw the show as deeply troubling, even offensive. This divide was most pronounced in the South and in traditionally conservative areas of the Midwest, where local CBS affiliates began receiving complaints almost weekly. Parents voiced concerns about what they saw as disrespect toward religion, patriotism, and traditional family values. Some wrote letters directly to CBS executives, accusing the network of promoting anti-American ideas. The most inflammatory responses came after particularly controversial episodes, such as when Joan Baez dedicated a song to her draft-resisting husband, or when David Steinberg's sermons mocked religious figures. For these viewers, the show's tone had crossed from comedy into insubordination. The volume and tone of the feedback CBS received revealed just how fractured the American viewing public had become. Internal memos from the time noted a rising volume of moral objections, particularly from religious groups and military families. While executives acknowledged the show's popularity with the coveted 18 to 25 demographic, they also feared alienating a broader base of viewers. Letters from both camps, supportive and critical, piled up at network headquarters, creating a portrait of a divided nation. CBS was caught between competing demands: protect its brand and appease its advertisers, or support a hit show that was increasingly pushing into political territory. This public pressure played directly into CBS's growing anxiety about the show's direction. Ratings remained strong, but the network's leadership became concerned that controversy would eventually outweigh commercial viability. Sponsors hinted at pulling out. Local stations threatened to stop airing the program, and public relations teams struggled to contain the backlash. For CBS, every new episode of the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour became a risk, not only to their ratings, but to their broader image as a stable, family-oriented broadcaster. The viewer divide wasn't just ideological, it became an operational crisis that would shape the network's final decision. But just as public tension reached a boiling point, one final episode would push the network beyond its breaking point. The CBS's cancellation decision. The final conflict between the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour and CBS reached its peak in early April 1969, with the submission of an episode that included David Steinberg's most daring sermonette yet. The episode had been completed in-house and submitted to CBS's West Coast censors on schedule, according to Tom Smothers. However, the content, particularly Steinberg's sermonette that equated President Nixon with Pharaoh and framed Moses as a conscientious objector, immediately triggered alarm within the network. CBS claimed the episode violated the required 10-day advance submission policy, providing a procedural justification to block its airing. Tom Smothers insisted the tape was delivered on time and accused CBS of intentionally delaying review at its New York headquarters to to justify censorship. Behind the scenes, the dispute between the Smothers production team and CBS executives grew increasingly hostile. CBS had previously warned that Steinberg was not to be invited back after the backlash from his earlier segments, which had already sparked complaints from affiliates and religious groups. Despite this, Tom brought Steinberg back, doubling down on the show's commitment to political commentary. The New York-based network executives, led by CBS chairman William Paley, demanded that Steinberg's segment be entirely removed if the episode were to air. Tom refused, standing by his creative decision, even as CBS made it clear that the inclusion of the sermonette could threaten the show's future. The standoff revealed a complete collapse in trust between the creators and the network's leadership. On April 4, 1969, CBS abruptly terminated its contract with the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. There was no formal press release, no farewell episode, and no announcement to the viewing public. The show, which had been one of the most talked-about programs on television, simply vanished from the schedule. In its place, CBS aired Hee Haw, a rural comedy variety show that offered light entertainment with no political edge. The replacement was no coincidence. It signaled CBS's decision to return to safer, controversy-free programming that would not provoke viewer complaints or affiliate resistance. The sudden cancellation sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry. For fans and younger viewers, it was a shocking silencing of one of the few programs that reflected their values and frustrations. For CBS, it was a calculated move to regain control of its public image and appease the network's more conservative base. While the episode that triggered the cancellation never aired in the United States, a version of it did appear on Canadian television, and bootleg copies began circulating on college campuses shortly after. The fallout from that single tape marked the end of a groundbreaking era in television, revealing just how fragile creative freedom could be when pitted against institutional power. Off-air and outcast. The abrupt cancellation of the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour in 1969 had immediate and far-reaching consequences for Tom and Dick Smothers. Despite the show's high ratings and cultural relevance, the brothers found themselves effectively blacklisted by the television industry. Networks and advertisers, wary of controversy, viewed the duo as liabilities rather than assets. Offers for new projects dried up almost overnight, and their names became synonymous with risk in executive circles. The message from the industry was clear. Challenging authority, especially through primetime television, came with a professional price. In the wake of their dismissal, Tom and Dick filed a lawsuit against CBS, claiming the network had breached its contract by using a submission deadline as a pretext to cancel the show for political reasons. The legal battle dragged on for years, with CBS maintaining that the decision was procedural, not ideological. Meanwhile, the Smothers Brothers continued performing live, but without the national platform television once offered. Tom, especially, was viewed by many in the industry as too unpredictable and defiant to trust with another major program. The creative fire that made him a cultural provocateur was now seen as a professional hazard. The strain of these events took a toll on the brothers' personal relationship as well. While they maintained their on-stage chemistry and continued touring, privately, they disagreed about how the conflict with CBS had been handled. Dick, the more pragmatic of the two, believed that some compromise might have saved the show and preserved their standing in the industry. Tom, unwavering in his commitment to principle, felt that backing down would have meant betraying the values the show stood for. Though the rift was never public or bitter, interviews in later years revealed a quiet tension about the choices that had been made. In 1973, the courts ruled in favor of the Smothers Brothers, awarding them over $770,000 in damages from CBS. It was a symbolic victory more than a career-reviving one. By then, the cultural landscape had shifted, and the brothers' moment at the center of political comedy had passed. They never regained a prominent spot in network television, though their legacy grew over time through documentaries, live performances, and academic recognition. The industry may have sidelined them in the aftermath, but history ultimately remembered them not as troublemakers, but as pioneers of politically conscious entertainment. First sparks of satire. The influence of the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour on future television and comedy creators cannot be overstated. Among those most directly inspired was Lorne Michaels, the creator of Saturday Night Live, who publicly acknowledged the show as a blueprint for using comedy to challenge authority. Michaels saw in the Smothers Brothers a daring fusion of entertainment and political consciousness that was virtually unheard of on mainstream television at the time. Their willingness to tackle controversial subjects, book politically active musical guests, and embed social critique in humor helped redefine what variety television could be. For Michaels and others, the show proved that satire had a place in the spotlight, not just on the fringes. Many of the satirical elements pioneered on the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour would become staples in later sketch shows. Satirical news segments, exaggerated political impersonations, and deadpan monologues critiquing government policy were first tested on the Smothers stage. Their use of fictional editorial candidates, such as Pat Paulson, set the tone for later parody figures like Stephen Colbert's Faux Pundit or SNL's Weekend Update anchors. The show's balancing act, humor that made viewers laugh while forcing them to think, became a model for generations of comedic writers looking to combine cultural relevance with mass appeal. What also endured was the show's format shift, from traditional entertainment to deliberate commentary. Before the Smothers Brothers, variety shows were largely apolitical, built around musical performances and clean sketches. But Tom Smothers used the familiar structure as a Trojan horse, slipping in critical ideas under the cover of comedy. This approach deeply influenced how shows like SNL, The Daily Show, and Last Week Tonight developed their rhythm, using entertainment as a doorway to deeper political and social critique. The Smothers Brothers didn't just create a show, they carved a space for critical comedy within the mainstream. That legacy continues to ripple across modern television. Today's most influential satirical hosts, whether it's John Oliver, Trevor Noah, or Hassan Minhaj, owe part of their creative freedom to the risks taken by the Smothers Brothers decades earlier. By blending cultural irreverence with social responsibility, they picked up the torch from a show that was ahead of its time and paid the price for it. The Smothers Brothers laid the groundwork for a genre of media where jokes aren't just for laughs. They're acts of commentary, resistance, and, sometimes, revolution. Underground icon. After the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour was abruptly canceled in 1969, its impact didn't fade. It simply went underground. Though CBS had silenced the show on its network, the episodes, especially the unaired final one, found a second life through informal channels. College students, young activists, and fans disillusioned by the cancellation began circulating VHS recordings of the show, often taped from Canadian broadcasts or preserved from original airings. These bootleg copies were passed from dorm room to dorm room, screened at student union events, and traded like sacred artifacts of suppressed truth. In an era before YouTube or digital sharing, the circulation of these tapes relied on word-of-mouth networks and campus communities that valued the show as more than just television. It was treated as protest art that had been unjustly erased from the national stage. Unofficial preservation efforts extended beyond video. Fan-made zines, alternative press publications and underground newsletters began reprinting transcripts of band monologues, song lyrics that had been censored, and analyses of the show's political sketches. Some students even created hand-typed collections of Pat Paulsen's mock political speeches or David Steinberg's sermonette texts, distributing them in mimeographed booklets alongside Vietnam protest literature. The show became a touchstone in a broader cultural movement that refused to let dissenting voices be silenced. Its presence lingered not through official archives or mainstream celebration, but through the determination of viewers who felt its cancellation was a deliberate attack on free expression. What emerged from these efforts was an early form of bootleg culture, a decentralized, fan-driven system that prefigured today's digital remix communities. In resisting CBS's erasure of the show, fans effectively created an alternative distribution network for politically charged content. These bootlegs weren't merely about nostalgia. They were tools of resistance, preserving ideas that networks and advertisers deemed too risky for prime time. The very act of copying, sharing, and screening these recordings became a statement. It said that satire, when done honestly and courageously, belonged not just to the networks that aired it, but to the audiences that connected with it, and were willing to keep it alive at any cost. Over time, the legacy of these underground efforts helped reframe the Smothers Brothers' cultural role. Instead of fading into obscurity, they were slowly reintroduced to new generations who encountered their work not through official reruns, but through passed-down recordings and copies of copies. These rough, sometimes degraded tapes carried with them a kind of mythic status. They weren't just old TV shows, they were relics of rebellion. When the internet age arrived decades later, it was this bootleg culture that helped fuel the rediscovery of the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, paving the way for digital restorations, academic study, and mainstream recognition. In many ways, the show's continued relevance was secured not by the media giants who once silenced it, but by the underground networks that refused to forget. What once flickered through grainy bootlegs now blazes across digital screens, reigniting a legacy that refuses to stay buried. Legacy Reloaded. In the digital age, the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour has undergone an unexpected revival, fueled not by network reruns or anniversary specials, but by the organic momentum of online platforms. On TikTok, YouTube, Reddit, and other digital sharing sites, clips from the once-banned show have re-emerged, drawing millions of views and sparking renewed interest from younger generations who were born decades after the show was taken off the air. Snippets of David Steinberg's sermon, Pat Paulsen's mock presidential campaign, and musical performances from Joan Baez and The Who have been recirculated as short-form video content, often accompanied by hashtags related to political commentary or media censorship. These digital fragments, once smuggled through bootlegs and VHS tapes, are now freely accessible and reframed within current debates around freedom of expression, turning old footage into fresh fuel for new conversations. This resurgence has not gone unnoticed by today's comedic voices, many of whom credit the Smothers Brothers as foundational figures in political satire. Prominent hosts like Stephen Colbert, John Oliver, and Sarah Silverman have spoken publicly about the show's influence, not just in style, but in courage. Their tributes go beyond respectful homage. They often cite the Smothers Brothers as trailblazers who proved that humor could challenge power without losing its edge. Colbert, in particular, has noted how the show's ability to disguise radical critique within a familiar format helped establish a blueprint for satirical news programs that use comedy as both a shield and a weapon. These acknowledgments serve as a kind of retroactive validation, highlighting how deeply the Smothers Brothers spirit has been embedded into the DNA of modern political comedy. More broadly, the show's renewed visibility speaks to how its themes continue to resonate in today's media environment. Issues of censorship, political polarization, and the limits of acceptable discourse remain at the forefront of cultural debate. The Smothers Brothers' battle with CBS over a 5-minute sermonette now mirrors contemporary struggles between content creators and corporate platforms, as algorithms, advertisers, and brand safety policies dictate what can and cannot be said online. In many ways, their story is a precursor to the challenges faced by modern voices navigating digital gatekeeping. The core tension between creative expression and institutional control hasn't disappeared. It's simply shifted into new terrain. Ultimately, the legacy of the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour endures not just because it was ahead of its time, but because it remains painfully relevant. What once felt radical, questioning a war, mocking a president, invoking satire in place of reverence, is now part of the playbook for modern commentary. Yet the risks, then and now, are very real. That the forbidden episode can now be streamed freely across social media is both a victory for preservation and a reminder of how fragile that freedom can be. As new generations discover the show, not as a relic, but as a resonant voice from another era, they are reminded that speaking truth to power with humor is as essential and as risky as it ever was. If you found this story as shocking as we did, hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more untold moments from TV history. Don't miss the next video. It's queued up right here on your screen. Click it now to keep exploring the stories they never wanted you to hear.